thank you all for coming. It is my pleasure to introduce Laura Yares, who's my colleague at Michigan State University. Laura just published her first book, Jewish Sunday Schools, Teaching Religion in 19th-Century America. Laura has a PhD from Georgetown University and in religious studies, religious studies, and is, I actually don't know when we met. I was thinking about that. You've always just been there.
I've just always been around.
But is one of my favorite, in the very small world of Jewish education research, Laura is one of my very favorite people to talk to, one of the smartest historians in that small field, and an exceptional scholar, and has written a bunch of other really interesting articles that preceded this book, including one about the soul of children that was I think part of that was in the chapter for students in my class that you were assigned for tonight. It's great to be in conversation with Laura, so Laura's going to share a little about her book, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. Oh, sorry.
Oh, there's more.
Yeah. If you like the talk, you'll love the book. And you can buy it tonight on the back table.
It's true. I'd like to see those 5-cent royalty checks rolling in. So. Thank you, Ari, and thank you all for coming. I know that it's a really challenging time in so many ways, and so the chance to spend some time with you all and to think about a very different moment in American Jewish history is a really wonderful invitation. I'm very, very glad to be here, and not only because I live in Michigan and it's November. So the chance to see some sunshine is also very, very, very nice. So this is my book. It's about Jewish Sunday schools in 19th century America. And over the years that I've been researching this book and talking to people about it, I found that if you engage a group of Jews, usually adult Jews, in a conversation about their supplemental Jewish education, what you will get is just a litany of complaints. You'll get complaints about boring lessons, about forced attendance, and about yearnings for Sunday morning soccer practice. And I think this pattern is so well established, in part because Jewish Sunday schools have been only depicted in popular culture as an American Jewish rite of passage that Jews love to hate, right? So if you've seen the film A Serious Man, the Coen Brothers film A Serious Man, right? Sort of nebulous, drug-dealing religious education, or in so many of the stories by Philip Roth, like the story Defender of the Faith, for example, synagogue basement school, which can only be described as intellectual stagnation. I think cynical depictions of Hebrew school, Sunday school, are almost an American tradition unto themselves. One parent who participated in an ethnographic study of American Jewish education once reflected, "My son Eddie has told me that he hates Hebrew school." And I say, "Edward, that's wonderful. You're carrying on a Jewish tradition." Because when I went to Hebrew school, I hated it too. So giving up Sunday morning soccer to go to religious school at the local synagogue might seem like an age-old tradition for Jewish education. But in fact, in the long sweep of Jewish history, it began relatively recently. The invention of the Jewish Sunday school was part of a broader set of American attempts during the 19th century to reimagine religious learning as an activity that could be separated from secular schooling. And more specifically, it was an attempt to reimagine Jewish education as religious education, premised primarily on learning a set of faith commitments, rather than the much broader set of skills and knowledge that has often been taught in Jewish educational settings. So in my talk today, I'm going to tell you more about how those two intersecting projects created the foundations for American Jewish education, and of the Hebrew schools that so many Jews today say they love to hate. So let's start with the first project, the project of separating religious learning from secular schooling. And to put this into context, it's helpful to have the broader historical chronology of the emergence of public education in the US in mind. So universal tax-supported public schools began to be established across the northern states during the 1830s and 1840s. And the availability of these public educational options had a really profound impact on Christian educational providers. So Christian Sunday schools had previously offered both general literacy as well as faith-based education to children who could not otherwise afford to attend school during the week. But with the emergence of free public schooling, Christian Sunday schools began to adopt a more explicitly religious curriculum. So they differentiated Christian education from general studies, and they reimagined their role as providers of an explicitly religious learning, often in a quite evangelical key. The birth of explicitly religious Christian Sunday schools emerged in the last decades of the Second Great Awakening, an evangelical revival movement that sought to build a public American Protestantism. And in her history of the Christian Sunday school movement, historian Anne Boylan notes that Sunday school volunteers conducted street sweeps on Sunday mornings, ushering any children they found on the streets into their Christian religious schools, regardless of the child's particular religious proclivities. Evangelization efforts towards children were not restricted to Sunday mornings. Similar efforts seem to have been periodically at large in public school settings as well. Nominally, these schools might have been non-sectarian, but in reality, Jewish sources tell us that teachers took the opportunity to evangelize Jewish youth who enrolled as students. And even absent of explicit evangelism, Christian scriptures and teachings were often used as curriculum materials. So this is Isaac Lisa. He was the chazan of a major synagogue in Philadelphia, Congregation Mikveh Israel. And he founded this newspaper, the Occident and American Jewish Advocate. And he wrote in the newspaper very, very regularly that, about the dangers of allowing Jewish children to attend the nation's public schools. Children, he said, would be subject to prayers and readings and books with explicitly Christian themes, which were ostensibly non-sectarian, but essentially Protestant. So in 1843, he warned his readers that, quote, "We are in great error if we suppose that Christian teachers do not endeavor to influence actively the sentiments of their Jewish pupils. There are some, at least, who take especial pains to warp the mind and implant the peculiar tenets of Christianity clandestinely." So this was the context of the founding of the first American Jewish Sunday school in Philadelphia in 1838. It was a community school. It was independent rather than being created under any particular synagogue or congregation. The woman who rang the opening bell was Rebecca Gratz, a pioneering American-born Jewish woman from a wealthy, traditional Sephardic family, and she had dedicated her life to philanthropic work among Philadelphia's needy. Gratz's Hebrew Sunday School for the Instruction of Israelites, which was what she called it, offered its pupils a safe space to spend their Sunday mornings and a couple of hours of basic lessons in Judaism that she hoped would equip children with sufficient Jewish knowledge to rebut the claims of predatory missionaries. Now, Gratz's school offered a religious Jewish education that drew from contemporary Christian models. It wasn't a coincidence that Philadelphia was also the national headquarters of the Protestant Sunday school movement. Like the Christian Sunday schools, Gratz offered a Jewish education that was divorced from general studies. And like the Christian schools, the curriculum of the Philadelphia Hebrew Sunday School offered what Gratz understood to be a religious Jewish education. And this was a very specific interpretation of religion. Now, Gratz's curriculum was very different to that offered by other contemporary Jewish schools. So Jews in the 19th century could choose to send their children to full-day Jewish schools that taught both Jewish and general studies, for example. And there were also Talmud Torahs that were schools that met every afternoon during the week, specifically for Jewish learning. Now, these schools were usually limited to boys, and they taught these male students a range of Jewish subjects that included Hebrew, aspects of the Jewish legal tradition, and how to read the Chumash, the Pentateuch, usually with the commentary of Rashi, a 12th century French rabbi. Now, Gratz eschewed this curriculum. Her school offered English language prayers and Bible readings, and lessons that illustrated the importance of good morals and faith in God, and a few simple home rituals for celebrating the Jewish calendar. And unlike most of the more traditional schools, she opened her classroom to girls as well as boys. Now, this curriculum was a pragmatic choice. Teaching the Chumash, the Bible, in Hebrew, or the intense legal disputations of the Talmud, that was unrealistic for a once-per-week school. And neither Gratz nor the women who volunteered with her as teachers, they hadn't received any training in these subjects themselves when they were children. They hadn't attended intensive Jewish schooling, of course, because they were female. So quite simply, they taught what they knew. At the Philadelphia Hebrew Sunday School, Gratz and her fellow volunteer teachers offered concise lessons that were steeped in the values of 19th-century bourgeois female religiosity. They taught piety, benevolence, and virtuous conduct. Now, Gratz's initiative was a really timely intervention, and she created it in response to some really immediate social needs. During the mid-19th century, an influx of new Jewish immigrants arrived from Western Europe. Only 2,000 to 3,000 Jews, mostly of Sephardi origin, settled in America before 1800. But between 1820 and 1880, approximately 150 to 200,000 Ashkenazi Jewish immigrants from Western and Central Europe arrived in the United States. Now, for these immigrants, joining congregations and obtaining access to religious education for children was very challenging, of course, because of scarce financial resources. Children often helped to support their families by engaging in paid employment or piecemeal work or childcare for younger siblings during the week. They didn't really have many opportunities to attend all-day Jewish schools or Talmud Torahs held every weekday afternoon. So while Rebecca Gratz's Hebrew Sunday School was by no means the first Jewish educational institution in America, it was the first that sought to be broadly accessible to children irrespective of the financial capacities of their parents, their gender, their synagogue membership, or lack thereof. So what I want to emphasize here is that Gratz's idea of a school that met for a few hours on a Sunday morning and taught a limited range of curricular subjects, this was a pragmatic choice rather than a deliberately ideological one. She wasn't a proponent of the Jewish reform movement. She belonged to Mikveh Israel, which was a traditional Sephardic congregation. And she wasn't an advocate for the dismantling of traditional Jewish scholarship. Her goal was not a revolution in Jewish learning, but to create an institution that would be accessible to the children of the new arrivals. Now, the efficacy and the appeal of this pragmatic curriculum was really immediately apparent. And Gratz's Sunday School was quickly adopted by other communities outside of Philadelphia. So just a few months after Gratz opened her school, Sally Lopez, who was a member of a Reform congregation, Beth Elohim in Charleston, South Carolina, she created a Sunday school for the children of her community. And reportedly, Lopez would exactly replicate Gratz's lessons, which Gratz would write out to her and send her by mail each week. Another school, which was called the Association for the Moral and Religious Instruction of Children of the Jewish Faith, was created by the women of New York congregation Shereth Israel, a traditional Spanish-Portuguese synagogue later that year. It offered classes for poor Jewish children each Sunday, regardless of synagogue membership. And in 1839, 1 year later, another Sunday school was founded in Richmond, Virginia, by the Ladies' Auxiliary of Beth Shalom, another Orthodox congregation. It was led by a local Jewish woman. Her name was Emma Mordechai. What you may have noticed here is that the first Jewish Sunday schools were all created by women. And they were created by communities that really spanned the nascent denominational spectrum of American Judaism. Sunday schools were founded under the auspices of congregations that we would today describe as orthodox or traditional, and not only by synagogues that identified with the Reform movement. Many Jews today might think of Sunday school as a Jewish educational option that's primarily associated with liberal Jewish denominations. Yet in the 19th century, they were founded by Orthodox communities, and not only by Reform ones. Sunday schools were embraced by Jewish communities across the denominational spectrum because they were pragmatic and affordable for an American Jewish community that was largely comprised of financially insecure and mobile new immigrants. They seemed to offer a realistic model for Jewish learning. And I think to understand that, it's really important to remember that America offered really unprecedented latitude to its Jewish community. It offered congregational autonomy and the absence of recognized sources of communal authority, which made Jewish affiliations largely voluntary. So Sunday schools were an expedient and practical solution to the problem of how to provide a basic Jewish education to a Jewish community that didn't really see itself as tied to Jewish institutions. So it wasn't long before more intensive afternoon and all-day schools simply had to begin closing. And the Sunday school became the dominant model for Jewish education in America, a status it would retain until the early years of the 20th century. Now, from the outset, the Hebrew Sunday School defined Jewish education in explicitly theological religious terms. Jewish children were instructed in concise lessons, illuminating the religious truths of their tradition, primarily to equip them with a narrative to counter Christian truth claims. It was an attempt to engage Jewish children in understanding their own tradition in the terms of the reimagined Protestant Sunday School, as a religion that could be learned on a Sunday morning, separate from the business of general literacy. Now, for Jews to imagine Judaism in these terms, as a set of beliefs for private consumption rather than as, say, an all-embracing way of life, well, that certainly required the erasure of much that has historically been essential to Judaism and Jewishness. So Judaism, in the words of American Jewish theologian Mordecai Kaplan, more accurately resembles a civilization than a religion. Learning Judaism has historically been a matter of learning languages such as Hebrew and Aramaic, the language of the Talmud, methods of legal reasoning, foodways, cultural habits, calendar and folklore. Creeds, beliefs, or principles of faith have traditionally played mostly a minor role in the curriculum of Jewish learning. So defining Judaism as a religion, primarily focused on Judaism as a belief system, entailed a fundamental curricular overhaul of the business of Jewish learning. When I began my research on the history of Jewish Sunday schools in 19th century America, I was interested in tracing the implications of defining Judaism in the Protestant-inflected terms of religion for the purposes of education. I wondered, how did this change the ways that Judaism was taught and learned? How did defining Judaism as a religion shape how educators understood the relationship of Jews to other religious groups? And above all, how was the attempt to define Judaism as in religious terms shaped by contemporary ideas about what religion was and how religion should be defined? Now, if you've been trained in the field of religious studies, as I was, at some point you take a theories and methods course in which you learn that the field of religious studies was born in the 19th century. And it was born out of attempts to define what religion was and how it originated by scholars who were situated across multiple scholarly fields. Now, these studies in comparative religion broadly proceeded from the presupposition that religion was a transcultural, universal phenomenon. They promoted the idea that behind the bewildering multiplicity of world religions, there was a single genus, religion, whose origins could be mapped and whose development could be described according to evolutionary patterns that could stretch to fit across cultures and across history. Religion, these authors proposed, had an essential identity, and they sought to trace the variant ways in which this essence was animated in different cultural contexts. But most of these scholars were not neutral on the question of what good religion really looked like. They arranged the so-called world religions into progressive hierarchies, which almost always described Protestant Christianity as the most advanced incarnation of the religious genus. Now, what's interesting is that American Jews seem to have been very interested in this new branch of scholarship. So independent Jewish study circles formed to read and discuss the latest findings in the comparative study of religion, and they used popular texts that were published both in Europe and America, even those with explicitly Christian overtones. It's worth remembering that in the mid to late 19th century, comparative religious studies was a largely European enterprise. And for the predominantly German-speaking Jews who lived in America, the Atlantic was a quite permeable boundary. Many 19th century American rabbis arrived in the United States having studied, often to doctoral level, at prominent universities in Western Europe. In cases where they were born in the United States or if they arrived as young children, many of them returned to Europe for postgraduate studies or to earn their rabbinic credentials. So ties to the European intellectual scene remain pretty strong. American Jews read books published in Europe. They contributed to European Jewish journals and periodicals. They corresponded with European rabbis and intellectuals, and they kept abreast of European scholarly developments. Now, American Jews were interested in this emerging field of comparative religious studies because they interpreted its findings as serving particular Jewish needs. At a time of rapid assimilation among American Jews, coupled with the popularity of new secularist movements like free thought and Darwinism, these studies seem to confirm that religion was universal and religion mattered. And if religion mattered, then by extension, Judaism should matter in the lives of American Jews too. So in 1872, for example, a rabbi in Cincinnati, whose name was Max Lilienthal, he's here on the screen, he offered a sermon in which he argued that comparative religious studies offered proof of the importance of religion throughout history. The men of this new science teach us irrefutably, he said, that the human heart was always and in all possible forms longing and yearning for the infinite Father and Creator. By 1888, a rabbi in Chicago, Isaac Moses, could declare that among American Jews, everyone is interested in the question of where religion comes from. 19th century Jewish religious education was imagined and created amidst this enthusiasm for understanding the origins of religion and for exploring different ways that religion could be defined and conceptualized. It was incubated in a cultural context in which there was a growing sense of confidence that real religion was born from a single genus. I came to this project really mindful of the ideological diversity of definitions of religion that were operative in 19th century America. And I wondered, when 19th century Jewish Sunday schools, their educators and their students, when they were defining Judaism as a religion, what definitions were they using? And how did those definitions change? And what kind of cultural and rhetorical work did their different understandings of religion seek to do? Now, in previous histories of American Jewish education, the period of the 19th century heyday of Jewish Sunday schools has typically been dismissed with one or two lines of critique that these schools just diminish the complexity of Jewishness by trying to shoehorn it into the Protestant mold of religion. And scholars have mostly assumed that because the first Jewish Sunday schools were founded by women, and because women really predominated as teachers in the classrooms, the religious curricula that they offered represented little more than saccharine female spirituality. These critiques have broadly assumed that as the Sunday school movement spread nationwide, there was little to no development on the curriculum devised by Rebecca Gratz. In my research, I found that this was far from true. Jewish Sunday schools across the country reimagined their curricula in many ways over the course of the 19th century. What is more, as most Jewish Sunday schools were founded under the auspices of congregations, these schools quickly came under the control of male rabbis and under the control of all male education boards, who didn't necessarily share Rebecca Gratz's particular feminine brand of domestic spirituality. So clearly there was much more to the religious curricula of these schools than historians had previously assumed. I began my research in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and I quickly discovered that one of the most ubiquitously preserved materials from 19th century Jewish Sunday schools were catechisms. Now, if you're familiar with catechisms, you probably think of them as Christian, specifically Catholic religious texts, right? Seeing some nods. But in fact, in both Europe and in America, Jews wrote catechisms in enormous numbers during this period. And catechisms were the most popular textbook used in 19th century American Jewish Sunday schools. They were written mostly by rabbis to be used by students who were preparing for confirmation, which was a coming-of-age ceremony. Now, catechisms were succinct primers of Jewish doctrine and religious thought, and they were typically written in the form of questions and answers. Students were expected to memorize these texts with the understanding that if they did that, they would develop a really comprehensive set of basic Jewish knowledge. So as aids to memorization, catechisms represented an educational technology. And it was a technology that was really widespread in in American education during the 19th century. So memorization, quite simply, was how teachers thought that students should learn. In public schools, primers that were used to teach a wide range of subjects were popular throughout the 19th century and testified to a pervasive belief in the pedagogical power of rote memorization. And of course, church schools, both Protestant and Catholic, commonly use memorization of catechisms to teach the distinctive theologies of their various denominational movements as well. Now, what particularly piqued my interest in Jewish catechisms was that the question that most of these primers opened with was the question, what is religion? They made the project of defining religion into the first lesson that a Jewish Sunday school student was expected to learn. So Jewish authors who began their catechisms with the question, what is religion, implicitly seemed to be presupposing that Judaism was part of a broader phenomenon that could be called religion. Consciously or unconsciously, these authors rejected claims of Jewish existential uniqueness and acknowledged that Judaism was one of many religious traditions. When they answered the question, what is religion, they defined how the idea of religion could be understood in a Jewish context, and they explained where other religions stood in relation to Judaism. So most Jewish Sunday school catechisms began by defining the phenomenon of religion in general, and then proceeded on. Their second question was a definition of the Jewish religion in particular. Now, what was really fascinating to me as a religious studies scholar about these Jewish catechisms was that many of these authors incorporated scholarship from the emerging field of comparative religious studies into their definitions of religion, but not verbatim. When they utilized this scholarship, they inverted the hierarchies devised by Christian theorists, and they placed Judaism at the apex of the history of religious civilizations. In other words, these authors did not simply just imagine Judaism as a species of the genus religion. They imagined Judaism as the very embodiment of the genus itself. Now, the ways in which Jewish authors of catechisms defined religion changed and developed over the course of the 19th century. Early Jewish catechisms tended to define religion in overtly theological terms that emphasized the centrality of the divine. So here's our old friend Isaac Lisa, who was the Chazan of Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. And he wrote the first ever Jewish catechism to be written in America. He published it in 1839, and he wrote it for Rebecca Gratz to be used in her school. And he defined religion like this. Religion, he said, is the knowledge we have of God and the duties we owe in obedience to his will. To believe in God, he said, is to believe that everything I see around me, the trees, the flowers, the earth, the water, also the sun and the moon, and the thousands of stars that shine in the night sky, were made by the great Creator. So for Lisa, religion was all about God, and knowledge of religion was fundamentally knowledge of the divine. Now, many subsequent texts use Lisa's text as a model, because his, of course, was the first one. And consequently, we find many of the earlier catechisms written by American Jews replicating this theological definition of religion. So we see this, for example, in a catechism written in Michigan, written by Rabbi Elias Epstein. It was called Conferment's Guide to the Mosaic Religion, and he published it in 1868. And to his opening question, what is religion? Epstein writes, religion is the knowledge of God and the mode of worshipping him. Religion teaches the knowledge of God and his attributes, he continued, explaining, we experience religion when we recognize God as our omnipotent creator and Lord. As time went on, however, authors began to depart from Lisa's paradigm, and they began to emphasize other definitions of religion that they found particularly compelling. So this is Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise from Cincinnati, and he was the de facto leader of the American Jewish Reform movement. And he published a catechism in 1872 called Judaism, Its Doctrines and Duties. And in that catechism, he describes Judaism as the epitome of the genus religion, based on Judaism's inherent rationality. He writes, there is a religion without mysteries or miracles, rational and self-evident. It is in perfect harmony with modern criticism and science. This religion is Judaism. Therefore, it is the future religion of all mankind. We see similar sentiments in an 1896 catechism that was written in Charleston, South Carolina, by another Reform rabbi. His name was Barnett Alsace. Now, in his catechism, Alsace informs his child reader that Judaism is the religion that has the least amount of error intermixed with it. Judaism, he says, has nothing in it that demands credulity or blind faith. It has scarcely anything in it that may be called dogma. It is simple, exalted, and well fitted for acceptance by all mankind. Yet this he clarified with the addenda that if we believed that any religion were better or purer than ours, we should, as reasonable beings, become followers of it. Now, these two catechisms, both written by Reform rabbis, incorporated a theology of Judaism that Reformers referred to as Judaism's prophetic mission. This was a theory that emphasized that the rationale for maintaining Judaism in the context of modernity, in the context of assimilation, was that Judaism had something to teach the world. Namely, that the Jewish idea of religion was so pure, so rational, that it was inherently superior to all others, destined to become the future religion of humanity. For these authors of catechisms, this was the first lesson that a Jewish Sunday school student should learn. Now, prophetic mission is well known in the history of Reformed Judaism. What catechisms show us, however, is that towards the end of the 19th century, some Reform rabbis also began to temper these convictions as they became influenced by comparative religion scholarship that showed that all religions had some degree of truth. They were all species of the religious genus. Now, these authors defined religion in terms that emphasized the human experience of religion rather than the deity. And this human-centered understanding encouraged them to pay more attention to religions beyond the borders of Judaism. So let's look, for example, at Rabbi Kaufman Kohler. He's the stunning fellow on the screen. Now, he was a really influential Reform rabbi. He became the head of the Reform movement's rabbinical college after Isaac Mayer Wise, who we met a moment ago after he died. And Kohler was really interested in the idea of religion as a human phenomenon, as something that could be seen and existed across human space and time. So when he became the president of the Hebrew Union College, the seminary for Reform rabbis, one of the first things that he did was to institute the comparative study of religion. And in 1923, he authored a book analyzing the evolution of conceptions of heaven and hell in comparative religious traditions. In a 1888 sermon, he said, "Let religion be presented in its true fascinating garb, not as the religion of a sect or a church, to be at war with others or the target of an infidel, but as the great ideal power of life." So Kohler authored a catechism in 1898. It was called Guide for Instruction in Judaism. And in his answer to that opening question, what is religion? He explained that the ultimate source of religion was the human impulse for spirituality. The true source of all religion, he said, is the human heart. All the patriarchs and prophets of old, like all the good men among the heathen, derived their religion from this source. Religion, Kohler said, was innate to the experience of being human. Men of all times felt the need of religion, he explained in his catechism. They craved to know that God was near. The operative understanding of religion in Kohler's catechism defined the religious experience as a universal spiritual quest. Religion, Kohler's catechism explained, was the human experience of fearing or longing to know God. It was the human religious impulse that made religion truly universal. Yet, while he sought to articulate the universal dimensions of religion as a source of human spirituality, his catechism still retained that emphasis on prophetic mission. It retained the idea that Judaism was the ultimate embodiment of the genus religion. So in his catechism, he writes, God sent prophets or inspired teachers of morality to other people beside Israel, such as Balaam in the time of Moses, or Buddha in India, Confucius in China, Zoroaster in Persia, Socrates in Greece, and the like. Yet it was only to Israel, he clarified, that prophets were given to reveal God in man and thus to establish the true religion of humanity. The Jewish religion, he concludes, as far as it contains the essential truths and laws of morality, is intended to be the religion of the whole human family. The triumphalism of these assertions feels a bit strange, right? This confident belief that Judaism is destined to become the future religion of humanity. But it's pretty unusual in a Jewish setting. As historically a non-proselytizing religion, Judaism has historically had relatively little to say about the relative merits of other religious traditions. Yet the use of catechisms as an educational technology, especially with that distinctive opening question, what is religion? Well, that inspired Jewish educators to imagine Judaism in the context of religion more broadly. And in so doing, they inverted the hierarchies proposed by most of the authors who today we consider the founders of religious studies as a field, and who imagined Christianity as the ultimate embodiment of the phenomenon of religion. Jewish authors of catechisms named Judaism as the genus religion, with all other traditions simply derivative species. But why would they engage in this exercise? Well, the answer, of course, is for the purposes of education. Jewish authors of catechisms wanted to define religion in such a way that would provide children with a rationale for retaining their Jewish commitments. Perhaps it's unsurprising that in the context of a primer written for Sunday schools that were created to protect Jewish children from Christian missionizing, authors of catechisms would choose to describe Judaism as inherently more theologically oriented, or inherently more rational, or simply inherently superior to its Christian religious counterparts. So I think catechisms, therefore, offer a really intriguing set of sources to think through the ways that American Jews engaged with liberal religious discourse during the 19th century. We know that many Jews who engaged in 19th-century liberal religious movements regarded denominational boundary markers as porous rather than fixed. So 19th-century American Jews went to church if there was an interesting speaker or if there was a compelling spiritual experience to be had. They dabbled with new religious movements. They engaged with various forms of spiritual experimentation. And they did all this without necessarily departing from self-identification as Jewish. And all this points to the ways that American Jews saw the idea of religion as a fluid category that didn't have to be delineated by denominational boundaries. But when we look at catechisms, on the other hand, they show us that while rabbis and educators certainly acknowledged the fluidity of American liberal religion, and while they believed that religion may have been universal in human life, different only by the cultures and the contexts in which it was practiced, nevertheless, at the same time, they also sought to limit the free expression of Jewish religion within a hierarchy that was designed to compel Jewish loyalty. They wanted children to know that Judaism was indeed a religion, just like others, and that those traditions also bore the imprint of the divine. But only Judaism could know the divine in its fullness and could ultimately be the religion of the whole human family. Catechisms show us that American Jews, a small religious minority group, saw contemporary liberal discourse about the genus religion as malleable, something that they could alter and adapt to fit particular Jewish educational needs. Catechisms also show us, and this is a theme that I discuss in more detail in the book, that American Jews engaged in ways of thinking about religion that were racialized. When American Jews imagined religion in these hierarchical terms, hierarchies that they placed themselves at the head of, they also imagined the inverse of the spectrum. So 19th century American Jews, like 19th century American Christians, imagined religion in terms that were teleological, that imagined a linear hierarchy of progress from the most heathen of religions to the most spiritually sophisticated. In the first decade of the 20th century, American Jews would map these hierarchies onto the emerging science of child psychology to think about the anthropology of the Jewish child. As they wrestled with the question of whether Jewish children could appropriately read biblical narratives that seemed to conflict with modern science, for example, they used the idea that Jewish children might be possessed with an innate sense of religion to make pedagogical decisions about how to teach the Bible in modernity. This shows us that American Jewish authors of catechisms utilize these racialized schemas of comparative religion to make a set of claims about where Judaism fit into the modern world. These schemas allowed them to map their Judaism, for example, onto whiteness, because whiteness was always at the top of any hierarchy of cultural progress. These hierarchies of world religions offered Jews a map that they could use to show that Judaism was not in the domain of the heathen or the uncultured. In the maps of world religion created by white Protestants, to have ethnic religion meant to be partial, incomplete, confined to one part of the world. In the hands of these Jewish authors, however, ethnicity in fact offered access to a superior brand of rational spirituality. They utilized these hierarchies of world religions to write Judaism into the future. Now, textbooks written for children are not often taken seriously as sources of modern Jewish thought. In my book, I unearth the stories of the teachers and the students who attended 19th century Sunday schools in order to place their experiences in the context of broader Jewish questions about what it meant to understand Judaism in religious terms. Arguably, this was the premier question that Jews in modernity were trying to answer. I argue that educational sources illuminate how American Jews, at a grassroots level, wrestled with the question of how Judaism could be transposed into the Protestant-inflected idiom of religion during a time of enormous diversity in public conversations about what religion was and how it could be defined. In this talk, I focus mostly on one set of primary sources from this period, the questions and answers of 19th century catechisms. But in my book, I also trace how these ideas surfaced and were debated in other kinds of sources. I look at the gendered ways in which religion was imagined in the context of Jewish education. I look at the material culture of children's periodicals and other educational aids that were created to be used in classrooms. I look at new rituals that were created to celebrate Jewish coming of age. And I explore theories about the nature of childhood that Jews incorporated from the emerging field of developmental psychology. Running across all of these chapters, indeed the argument that is at the heart of this book in many ways, is the argument that we should take educational sources seriously as sources for understanding religious life, past and present. Educational sources are easy to dismiss as pediatric or useful only for scholars of learning who are seeking to improve contemporary religious pedagogy. I argue instead that education is where the grassroots effort of religious meaning-making gets done. It's where the complexities of theology and philosophy have to be rendered in their most intelligible terms. So to adapt religious studies scholar Anne Broad's famous dictum, the history of American Jewish education is the history of American Judaism. It's also the history of American Jewish religion. Now, today, supplemental Jewish schools remain the regnant form of Jewish educational institution attended by young, non-Orthodox American Jewish children. And this preference for the so-called Protestant model, in which religious schooling is undertaken on a supplementary basis, has long been judged to characterize the commitments of American Jews to participate in mainstream American life through the patronage of the public school system. Historically, it's also underscored the idea that Judaism, in modernity, should be primarily understood as a set of leisure time faith commitments. This model for Jewish education was created during the 19th century. It was created in the context of an unprecedented set of new public educational opportunities for American Jewish youth. And it was created in order to show American Jews that Judaism was a religion. The curricula of 19th century Sunday schools not only foregrounded that Judaism was one among the many religions of the world, but even that it might be the most superior incarnation of the very idea of religion itself. The referendum that's at large among American Jews today is whether this explicitly religious construction for Jewish education still has meaning for contemporary American Jews. So today, American Jews increasingly self-identify as so-called Jews of no religion, Jews who see their Jewish commitments in communal or ethnic or familial terms rather than religious ones. I think if this historical case of 19th century Jewish Sunday schools has anything to offer this ongoing referendum, it's maybe that Jews have never accepted the idea of religion as a stable and fixed concept 19th century Jewish educators did not just define Jewish education as religious education. They defined and redefined religion over and over again in their catechisms. And they made and remade their Jewish educational curricula in response to a changing landscape of ideas about what religion was and how far its parameters could stretch. The story of 19th century Sunday schools shows us that American Jews have historically had the chutzpah to see the idea of religion as a concept to be wrestled with, rather than either blindly accepted or summarily rejected. And after all, could there be anything more distinctively Jewish than that? Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. We have time for questions.
I have a question first. Who expected when they walked into the room that I was going to talk to you all about catechisms? No. Well, that's because you've read the book. Please.
What about Philadelphia made it possible? Like, what was different? What did it have that other cities didn't at the time that caused this confusion?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Okay, so we've got to go back to 1838, right? If today we think about where are the epicenters of American Jewish life, what are the locations that are the big centers of American Judaism, what are the cities that we might name? New York, right. New York, and New York. So good they named it. Many times. Okay, but in the 19th century and earlier, the cities where most Jews lived, right, were port cities. There were cities that were centers of trading, right, because that was the industry, that was the economic sector that Jews were involved in. And so Philadelphia was a center of that. And Rebecca Gratz's family were very, very heavily involved in shipping and trading. That was how they made their wealth. And so Philadelphia at the time really was a really, really important center of Jewish life, on par to how we might imagine New York today. And so I think if we said, hey, a big Jewish innovation came out of New York, we'd say, oh, that's not very surprising, right? Similarly in Philadelphia, this was quite simply where there were large numbers of Jews, and where Jews had lived for a long time, like Rebecca Gratz, so that they had become wealthy and established, and Rebecca Gratz and the women who volunteered alongside her, because they were wealthy women, they had leisure time to spare. They could spend that time engaging in volunteer work. So that's the answer to your question.
Hi, thank you. My name is Zahava. I'm one of Ari's students as well. I'm curious, you pulled up the Moses and the Lilienthal quotes, and I saw they're both from the American Israelite, which, from my understanding, was Isaac Verweiss' paper, which would also encourage me to think it was reform-leaning. So I'm curious, of those Jewish educators and thinkers who were interpreting Judaism within this hierarchy of religions and racialization, was that more common in this reform movement of the late 1800s, or was it also appearing in other denominational Jewish spaces?
Yeah, that's a great question. So American Jewish newspapers are really important sources for the 19th century. Why? There was no internet, right? That was a really primary way in which Jews communicated with one another. There was no internet, there weren't movies, there wasn't television, right? And so the periodical press, newspapers and magazines, were a really, really important part of public culture. And so often what you see in American Jewish newspapers are things which today you might think of being sort of quite mundane, but at the time, we're a good source of news. So if a rabbi, gave a sermon, it might be reprinted in a newspaper, for example. Or if somebody gave a talk, a transcript, what we call the transcript of the talk, would be printed in the newspaper as well. If there was a big event like this one, the beautiful picture of this pageant in Oregon in 1898, you might get a write-up akin to like a theatre review, for example. And I mention this to say that although some of the newspapers had ideological kind of directions to them, and their editors had ideological directions, they really published anything, because this was the sort of the way that ideas and information was communicated. When we think about the 19th century, if we were to kind of drop down into the middle of sort of 19th century America, say in the sort of 1870s or 1880s, we might think that clearly the future direction of Judaism in America was that everybody was going to be reform, right? Because that was simply the most popular movement at the time. It wasn't until the later part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, with the arrival of immigrants from Eastern Europe between 1881 and 1924, that the spectrum of American Jews really begins to diversify. And so we can see this, for example, this proclivity towards reform, the idea that Reform Judaism, was going to be the American way. We can see this really clearly in the titles that Isaac Mayer Wise gives to the institutions that he founds, right? The Hebrew Union College, that was his seminary. He talks about Minhag America, this prayer book, the American Minhag, the American custom. The rabbinical association he created, the congregation association, was the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. So lots and lots of confidence. So we see a lot of Reform rabbis utilizing these hierarchies simply because there were a lot of Reform rabbis, right? That was the most numerous movement. But you do see them. We do see them in catechisms that were written by more traditional, what we might today call conservative, Masorti, kind of Orthodox rabbis as well. What seems to be more important than denominational identity is relationship to intellectual life in Europe. Quite simply, rabbis who had studied in Europe, who spoke German, read German, and were sort of conversant in this scholarship, seem to have found it interesting and relevant, and that seems to be more important than denominational proclivity in who use them. But you see it in almost every catechism from this period that asks that question: what is religion?
Thank you so much. This is fascinating, and I am also one of those adults that has nothing but bad things to say about their synagogue experience. But that's besides the point. I had a question for you, because I noticed that Rebecca Gratz, and it seems like at least one of the other kind of female founders of Sunday schools were both Sephardic. Mm-hmm. And then I assume there was a lot of Ashkenazi Jews who were attending them. Yeah. And I was wondering about that dynamic. I am in French and Francophone literature, and so I'm very used to in that field where Sephardi Jew is code for brown Jew, is code for backward orientalizing discourse. But then discovering that the Sephardim were like, who are these backwards bumpkins that don't know anything? We are educated. So there's like these kind of like dueling discourses of who has the civilizational or who is more that kind of thing. And I was wondering, did that play out at all? And how did that work?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and that theme kind of shows up in the book in a number of ways. So when when we see the mass the migration of Central and Western European Jews, in the 1830s and 1840s, before that, the Jews who lived in America were mostly Sephardi. Right, that was the population who had come to America in the 17th and 18th century because of their connections to trade, because of the diaspora of Sephardi Jews. So by the time the Western Europeans arrived, the Sephardi Jews were the ones who had simply been here for a while, and they, like Rebecca Gratz's family, had been able to amass personal wealth. And so it was the Western Europeans who were the country bumpkins and the new arrivals. The Sephardim were the ones with the well-established synagogues, the institutions, the women's benevolent societies, and the Western Europeans still had to build that up. Fast forward, though, of course, mass arrival of over 2 million Jews from Eastern Europe and Russia between 1881 to 1924. And you see that orientalizing and othering discourse very, very, very prominently, and it's being employed by the Ashkenazi Jews, who by that point had been there for a couple of generations. And so something I didn't talk about today, but do talk about in quite a bit in the book, is how this sort of schematized way, this mental map, right, of religious hierarchy and religious progress becomes an intra-Jewish hierarchy as well, that is mapped onto the Eastern Europeans to describe their particular practice of Judaism, Orthodox practices, for example, even secularist practices as well, as something that is less culturally sophisticated than the bourgeois German Jews, who by that point had been there for a couple of generations. And so it's really, really very clear that when they're using these schemas, these hierarchies, they're not neutral. They're heavily racialized, and they're racialized even when applied to Jews and not only to non-Jews. It's a great question.
Hi. Firstly, thank you so much. This was wonderful to hear. So my question is, you mentioned the development of a racialized discourse, and I wonder how that interacts with how Judaism is defined. So you had discussed how with the invention of the Sunday school, Judaism became kind of divorced as it was theological, defined in theological terms, and that it was Jewish practice was, I guess, isolated from other aspects of Jewish civilization and cultural aspects. How does that change when scientific racism essentially enters the picture at the end of the 19th, early 20th century? How does that change when suddenly there's a discussion of Jews as a racial group? Does the curriculum change? Does the discourse around this change? Sorry, this is maybe pushing you a little into the 20th
Not at all.
century.
I try and stay in the 19th. Well, it's almost sort of strange to think this now, because of course we know what happens when this racialized discourse is applied to Jews in the mid 20th century, right? That when Jews are described as a race that is laden with anti-Semitic overtones, that of course is used to justify the Nazi attempt at the extermination of European Judaism. In the 19th century, though, again, this kind of schematized way of thinking about what Jews are, rabbis found that pretty useful in various ways, right? So it's this sort of question of what kind of rhetorical and cultural work do these definitions do? And the reason they found it useful was, again, because it seemed to have the potential of being able to compel Jewish loyalty. So that in the context, right, of a very assimilated American Jewish population, particularly at the end of the 19th century, right, where really just unprecedented latitude, Jews were not joining synagogues, they were assimilating, they were living their best lives. When rabbis start to use the language of race, they use it to say, but you can't get away from your Judaism. This is inherently a part of who you are. And the world at large will never quite accept you, right? Because you have this dimension that is racial. And it's hard to think about this now without thinking about some of the ways in which this is playing out in our contemporary moment. So it wasn't seen as something that was necessarily negative. In fact, this idea of Judaism as this innately superior of religion gets quite easily mapped on, right, to this racial dimension. Because you can claim that this group, the Jews, who have this ethnic and racial identity, right, produced this idea of religion, right, which has these markers of superiority, of rational superiority, of spiritual superiority. even to the extent that you see Reform rabbis making very strange moves. So Rabbi Barnett Elsass, for example, who came up, who wrote his catechism in 1898, he writes a ton of stuff discouraging conversion to Judaism. He says you can never convert. You can't convert to Judaism, right? No one should be converting to Judaism. You know, if you are married to a non-Jew, you shouldn't convert to Judaism because, and these are his words, so I want to make it very clear that I am here reporting, not endorsing, that in his view, because Judaism had such a strong racial dimension, you could never convert to it. A conversion could never be legitimate because it didn't have this racial dimension. And that's very strange for a Reform rabbi to say, right? Reform with this idea of Judaism's inherent religiosity, right? With these inherently religious markers. So in the 19th century, into even in the 20th, race is this very malleable concept that gets mapped onto religion in some really, really dynamic ways. It can both be used in this sort of hierarchical mode as a way of othering Eastern European, particularly Orthodox immigrants, and it's also used by Reform rabbis in order to try and convince, right, otherwise assimilated Jews to take their Judaism seriously.
I have another one. So I'm going to do that annoying thing where I'm going to ask about something that's interesting to me from my research. But I was wondering, I noticed that I don't work in the American context, and I'm curious about the use of the word Israelite in English and in America, because I know why we have Israelite in France and in the French context, and I don't know if it's the same reason or if that was just like another lovely synonym to have so you don't repeat the same word over and over. Or if it's just not that exciting, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, very commonly used in the 19th century. Of course, not so much today, but not particularly remarkable. Yeah.
So you described at the start Sunday school broadly as part of a rite of passage, and it seems to me when it started off, it wasn't necessarily a rite of passage, it was kind of service for the community. And at some point it became institutionalized as a rite of passage. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, what else came in with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Rebecca Gratz creates the first Sunday school in 1838. That year, 2 more schools follow, more and more, and it spreads across the country, right? It's founded by women, and then within a generation, really, is taken over by men. And so, you know, in the 19th century, this really is the model of Jewish education. What changes in the 20th century, in the first decades of the 20th century, is, of course, the arrival of the Eastern Europeans, who bring with them a number of other kinds of models for what Jewish education could look like. But what, in the post-war period, I think sort of ultimately sets the course for Jewish education as we have it today is suburbanization, right? So many of the models that are pioneered by in the first decades of the 20th century sort of assume that Jews are going to be living in these sort of dense ethnic enclaves of downtown, right? The sort of the Jewish areas of, you know, places like the Lower East Side. And they built educational models that sort of assumed that children would be living in these densely Jewish neighborhoods. In the context of post-war suburbia, that wasn't the life that most American Jews were living, right? They were living in suburbs that may have had, you know, more or fewer Jewish residents, but they were living amongst others. And so the synagogue really becomes the place where American Jews go to do their Judaism, right? And the synagogue tries to sort of expand and become, you know, a broader community center, and huge synagogues are created in the post-war era, like campuses that incorporate these big education wings and gift shops, right? All sort of underscoring the logic that this is where you go to do your Judaism. And so I think what the sort of rite of passage as you mentioned, or the sort of institution and the reason that I think that American Jewish education, this synagogue model for American Jewish education, looks really very, very like the Sunday schools, is that it really underscores the idea that Jewish education is religious education. The place where you do it is the synagogue. The thing that you're preparing for is your bar bat or bar mitzvah, maybe followed by confirmation, right? The thing that you are learning to do is to lead a religious service, right? The thing that you have to memorize, because there's still memorization, even if it isn't catechisms, people are still listening to audio tapes of their Torah portion, right? And learning to chant it without necessarily understanding what they're doing, right? That you are performing this religious act. And that's not the only model for what Jewish learning has to look like, but it remains in that idiom of religion. And I think, as I said, the referendum amongst American Jews today is whether that's still a relevant model.
Thank you. Go ahead, Chana, and then we'll do one more.
So you showed us a section of Kohler's Catechism where he mentions as like a inspired teacher of morality or prophet, like Socrates and Confucius, but no Jesus. Is this a strategic omission?
I think was that the one in Kohler, or was that in the Kohler one? Let me see if I can pull that up. Oops. Let me pull that up. I don't remember, to be perfectly candid, whether let me find him. Whether he there we go. Whether he mentions Jesus elsewhere in his catechism. So I have to say I don't know. I'd have to go back and check. It may have been strategic, but also Jews were really interested in Jesus in the 19th century, especially German Jews, and Kaufmann Kohler was very much a German. And they were interested in Jesus because they really wanted to reclaim him as a Jew. So the wonderful scholar, Susanna Heschel, has a wonderful book on Abraham Geiger, who's really the founding father of Reform Judaism in Germany. And he writes this doctoral work on the figure of Jesus. And so Geiger kind of sets the course for the people who studied with him, including Kaufmann Kohler. And they think that it's really interesting to recover Jesus, because it is a way of demonstrating, right, that Reformed Judaism as they imagined it wasn't all that different to Christianity if you went back to the source, right? The idea that Paul was really the sort of corrupting force that made Christianity into its anti-Semitic, supersessionist incarnation, but that if you went back to the source, if you went back to Jesus, you would find a model for Jewish-Christian relations that was actually very, very compatible, literally very, very compatible. And so 19th century Jews, very, very interested in scholarship around Jesus and in reclaiming Jesus as one of their own.
All right, so here's my question. In my class, I had like a normal syllabus queued up, and so we had 2 weeks of normal class, and then the war broke out, and we turned our attention to the various dimensions of that. But in the 1 week of like really normal class that we had, we talked about Judaism becoming a religion. So this is great because it's spot on. And my question is about the move from that sort of first generation of women, Rebecca Gratz and the others that you mentioned, into the catechisms and the transition, because you referred to that first wave as pragmatic, like super pragmatic, right? The women taught what they knew. They didn't study Talmud, they didn't study Rashi, but they knew like domestic ritual and so on. And it seems like the catechisms were and so they were like teaching people what to do, and these guys were teaching people what to think or what to believe. And so what happened to the doing part in the catechism? Did the catechism also have like instructional matter that the students were like, here's how you light candles for the Sabbath, or here's how you like lead a Passover Seder? Or were these guys all about like, because it's religion, it's about belief, and we're gonna leave that stuff off the table?
So the answer is all of the above. Some catechisms did. Some catechisms did have a lot of doing in them. So catechisms were written mostly by rabbis, mostly by men, people who were usually teaching the confirmation class of schools. So chazans or rabbis. There's two that were written by women, but they're really the exception to the rule. And so they were written to prepare students for confirmation, and so they were really focusing on these things that students would have to demonstrate their knowledge of. But when you look at catechisms that were written specifically by Orthodox authors, they tend to do more of the doing. So they have calendar, kashrut, a sort of précis biblical history. You even get sort of songs in them, like melodies, like musical notation. And you do see in a number of cases where rabbis or chazans are serving communities that are moving in the direction of reform, but still sort of navigating community members who are more tied to traditionalism and some who are more tied to reform. You know, in a generation, they're going to have a break-off congregation, right? But they're navigating that moment. You see them doing a sort of half and half, and half will be about belief, and half will be more focused on the ritual, the doing, the siddur, the Jewish calendar, basics of kashrut, that kind of a thing. But amongst Reform rabbis, right, catechisms are really focused on belief. And I think that's not necessarily because they devalued aspects of practice. They certainly did, right? But there were certainly aspects of practice that they incorporated, but simply because the use of catechisms was really about confirmation. That's chapter 3 of the book. Where catechisms really came into their own was when a child had memorized these questions and answers, right? So imagine that, and catechisms were pretty small. They were pamphlets. They're probably not much thicker than, most of them are not much thicker than this. That's why so many of them have survived, because they made so many of them. A child would have all these pamphlets full of questions and answers, and they would memorize them. And then imagine the confirmation ceremony when you have this class of students who are dressed in their kind of finest regalia, and the synagogue is beautifully decorated, because confirmations were usually held on Shavuot, the holiday of Shavuot. And there's a tradition on Shavuot that you decorate with flowers, because there's a midrash that Shavuot celebrates the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai historically. And there's a midrash, there's a teaching that when the Torah was given, Mount Sinai kind of burst into flowers, right? Flowers, which is it's in the middle of the desert. It's very miraculous. Anyway, so there's this history, there's this penchant for decorating with flowers, and so imagine you've got these synagogues that are just full of flowers, and they're parading to the front of the room, and the class they're all standing there, and they're holding bouquets, including men. The boys are all holding bouquets as well. And the rabbi says, "You, what is religion?" And the child is able to parrot, this beautifully worded definition of religion. Like, you, what is what is God? And so if you are a parent sitting there or a community member, right? And you're watching this performance, and it very much is a performance, and you haven't got that catechism in front of you. You say, wow, these children know so much. Almost like if you're walking into an American synagogue today and you hear somebody doing their Torah portion, right? And so catechisms are really interesting because they take on this performative dimension. So they're not sort of reliable indicators of what an individual author might have thought about the role of practice, of doing in Judaism. I think we have to see them as taking on this performative function as the ceremony of confirmation becomes this very kind of opulent, lavish affair. Teaching practice was hard because there was so much disagreement on what practice actually looked like, right? In the context of a very assimilated American Jewish community, among communities that had a mixture of traditional and reform. And so ironically, the thing that was the most common denominator were questions like, what is religion? what is God? And if you focused on those, you could actually avoid the question of what does it mean to actually practice as a Jew.
Thank you. Thanks so much,
Awesome.
Laura.